serve on the Literacy Screener Advisory Group and have a lot of boots on the ground experience with iReady, and wanted to discuss how you guys brought up the 13-point discrepancy, and if you look at each of the constraints that we looked at, that discrepancy becomes much wider, and it also gives us a little insight into what that might look like for a school to help them identify a student who is struggling. And I think that's what we have to keep at the forefront of this conversation is, does it help us identify those students? If it fails to do that consistently, the student will never get to the interventions that we keep bringing up in this conversation, which I know are important, but they'll never get to those interventions if this fails to identify them. And that happens quite frequently with iReady. The reason it does is because if you look at the constructs measured, which were all aligned to each of the state laws, HB 538 and SB 48, you'll notice that iReady scored 6 points below the mean of the top 4. So there's a giant discrepancy in how it measures the constraints of the law. 6 points off the mean. So that's taking that top screener that we have, Amira, down to the bottom one on our top 4. And even the mean, it's 6 points off of that. So that's how it closely aligns to the law as it is written. That is a little concerning. Each of those areas we measured, not just does it measure the constraint of the law, but how well it measures it. And what does the data tell us about the validity and the reliability of that tool to measure each of those constraints? So it scored poorly, which on the boots on the ground, what that looks like is a child can take that assessment, and iReady has a history of a child doing well early on in that assessment on lower skills, and because it does well on the lower skills, it never moves the child to more advanced skills. Children who have dyslexia have the capability of learning to read, so it's likely that they can do well on those lower portions of those assessments. But because the test no longer continues to assess them and it tests them out, which is language that iReady uses in their reports, we never know that they are struggling in more advanced skills that go beyond foundational levels. Therefore, those children are often tested average. And then these children get to 3rd and 4th grade and can't read. And now we have children who can't read and they've adopted more comorbidities. So it's important to know that those 13 points matter. It's very simple for us in a room to think, oh, it's just 13 points. But 13 points actually means that there's weaknesses in how that assessment is getting the information that teachers so desperately need to work with our students. Another area that I want to address, I won't go through all of the areas because I know we have limited time, and I do appreciate you giving me this moment to speak. But I also wanted to address that it is very limited feedback to teachers, which was another area that it scored poor on. It gives a more global, large picture. It lacks detailed information on what the child is specifically struggling with, which can lead to an overgeneralization with interventions. Once again, the end goal is to get the kid into interventions. If the teacher doesn't have specific information about what the child is struggling in, they are more likely to not know how to individually and specifically intervene for that child to make progress so that we can see our students become proficient readers. And my last point that I wanted to address was, you'll notice on the constraints that Dr. Lindy shared yesterday on page 10 of her slideshow, that we have the progress monitoring tools as well as the administration time. We talk about teachers and districts. One of the greatest gifts we can give a teacher is time. It scored very low on the amount of minutes. It takes a long time to administer the iReady. Schools are spending a lot of time giving the iReady, using the diagnostic tools. This also has a reputation on the street where students begin to hate iReady because oftentimes when it doesn't actually identify their correct needs, because it has a pretty poor sensitivity level, that those children end up working on skills either below or above their level, so they're constantly frustrated and annoyed at having to sit on these computers and work on these levels because it has misguided their level and given us poor information. So I think it's really important. My big point here to say is those 13 points matter, especially when you look at the mean of the top 4. You can see how far off it is in each of the specific areas. But I think the most important is off on the constraints of the law. It's 6 points off the mean, which means it's poorly doing its job. Is it doing its job? Yeah, it is, but it's poorly doing its job. We want our students to be able to have access and our teachers to have access to tools. as an educator and a parent in a system where I sit daily in IEP meetings and I see the results of this on the ground and how children are not being identified and they're not having access to MTSS and the proper interventions, I would respectfully wish and for you guys to reconsider adding a screener that does not have a reputation, but also the data that we collected over a very lengthy process at the great guidance of the Deal Center, and remove this screener from the list and go with the ones that were properly vetted so that we can ensure that every kid in Georgia can become a proficient reader. Thank you for your time.
Ms. Purcell,